I'd like to take some time to go over some of the fundamental structures of the human skull. I'll try to go in the same order as the terms appear on your handout, but if I miss a few or if I go in the wrong order, just be patient with me. We'll try to get all of them covered as quickly as we can. The skull itself is made up of a number of different bones that have been fused together to form a relatively solid structure. We'll cover the different bones individually, identify their boundaries as well as the landmarks and structures that are associated with each of those bones. This list is not exhaustive. There are a lot of different structures that we won't identify, but I'll try to give you the majority of the ones that I think are critical to have a foundational knowledge of that. The skull itself is an interesting type of bone, or the bone that make up the skull is an interesting type because it's largely, the bones are largely kind of flat plates that have been that are curved to conform to either the shape of the brain or to produce the shape of the head. But if you look on the interior of those bones, for example on this skull here, you can see here that you've got kind of a hard outer shell on the outside and then a harder inside shell, and then in between what looks like a kind of softer material. As you remember from your other anatomy classes, you know that the outer shell and the inner shell are compact bone and the stuff in between is cancellous or spongy bone. When you see this kind of an arrangement of compact, spongy, compact, that's referred to as diplo. That's the first term on your list. So diplo refers to that kind of sandwich arrangement of compact, spongy, compact bone. Periodically on the bones of the skull, just like you see with other bones elsewhere in the body, you'll see small openings, like this one right here, that conduct blood vessels into the interior of the bone to feed the cells of the bone. This is referred to as a nutrient foramen, and you'll see them periodically throughout the bones. This one's kind of an older skull, so you don't see quite as many. There's a good one right there. You can kind of see. The real skulls have them in abundance. Plastic ones, like this one here, don't have many at all because they're not completely faithful replicas. All right. On this skull here, there's a few landmarks to be aware of. Where many of the bones of the skull come together, they do so in a kind of zigzag pattern where the bones have interdigitated with one another. These are called suture joints. They're a type of fibrous connective joint. And here, at the top, where the frontal bone meets the two parietal bones, this point right here is called bregma, and it's that kind of union point there where the three bones come together. That's called bregma. The term vertex refers to the highest point of the skull, and in this case, as you kind of look at the skull from the side, you can see it's kind of about right here, very close to where bregma is. And so you'll hear the terms bregma and vertex sometimes used interchangeably. But bregma is an actual landmark, whereas vertex refers to the highest point. The term lambda refers to this union here between the two parietal bones and the occipital bone. And I think it's because this sort of structure looks like the lambda of the Greek alphabet, but it refers to that union point right there. Nasion refers to this indentation right here at the top of the nose, where the nasal bones join the frontal bone. That's nasion. And the pterion refers to this side on the lateral part of the skull, where you have several bones coming together, the frontal, the parietal, and the sphenoid. Now, it's a little easier maybe to see on this one, where you can see a kind of suture coming up along here, and then a cross suture there. and then forward here another kind of suture coming up. That area right there is the pterion, and it kind of looks like an H almost, where you've got kind of the upper beams here and a cross beam coming across there. Now the reason why the pterion is kind of an important landmark is that it represents the thinnest part of the neural cranium. So notice how thin that bone is right there. The other part that's clinically significant to the pterion region is that on the interior, I'll try to show this the best I can here. On the interior there, you can see a kind of indentation coming from this small foramen right here and coming up along the inside there. That indentation or groove is formed by the middle meningeal artery. And you can kind of see that it lies here just on the inside of the pterion. So clinically, this is an important region because if you were to fracture your skull, particularly in this side area here, you could potentially disrupt the middle meningeal artery on the other side and create significant internal bleeding within the skull. Okay, so those are a few of the terms to be aware of with just the skull in general. All right, we're going to tackle each bone in turn now and identify a few landmarks that I think are important to understand. So we'll begin with the frontal bone here in the front. You can kind of see the extent of the frontal bone. Here's the suture along the top. If I can get you, see if it's possible to see that. There we go. So you can see that it forms the majority of your forehead. Okay, it comes down along the side here, and then at this point here, the frontal bone connects to the zygomatic bone, which we'll come to in a moment. And then it comes across here and forms the upper ridges of the orbit. And then if we look inside, we find that it actually forms the upper wall, or the ceiling of the orbit as well. Okay, so you can kind of see it, get a sense of that. If we go in the interior, this portion here represents the other side of the orbit. So this is all frontal bone back until you get to about here. Okay, so it comes along back to about this point right here. So all of this is frontal bone. So let's take a look at some of the structures that you need to know with this. The first structure is this indentation right here between the two eyebrows. That indentation is called the glabella. Then you have the supraorbital margins. That's these ridges that form the upper part of the orbit margin. And within that, those right behind these kind of bumps right here are air pockets within the bone. And we saw an example of that air pocket right here. Okay, on that one. This is the frontal sinuses, and they can be of varying sizes and organization. Sometimes there'll be, one on each side. Sometimes there'll just be a single one spanning across there. It's one of the paranasal sinuses, that air pockets that communicates with the nasal cavity. So that's the frontal sinus. Okay, if we go into the interior of the frontal bone and look inside here, so orienting it so up is anterior now. These portions of the frontal bone here that overlie the orbit themselves are called the orbital plates. And then right here in the center, you can kind of see this ridge coming down here. And at the base of that ridge is a small opening. That's the foramen cecum. That will transmit a small vessel known as the emissary vein. And then behind that is a portion of the ethmoid bone found right here, which we'll come back to in a few moments. And then finally, we have this protruding portion of the frontal bone coming down right here that connects to the zygomatic bone on this side, and that's called the zygomatic process. These processes are protrusions or extensions of the bone that typically connect it to another structure, in this case to the zygomatic bone. These structures are named for the bone they connect to, not the bone they come from. So this would be the zygomatic process of the frontal bone, meaning the part of the frontal bone that connects to the zygomatic bone. The next bone is the zygomatic bone. That's this roughly triangular shaped bone here. The majority or the body of it forms the cheekbone in our anatomy. But it actually connects to several other bones. So it connects up to the frontal bone, it connects posteriorly to the temporal bone, and it connects anteriorly to the maxilla. Each of these parts are named, of course. So this portion coming across here is referred to as the zygomatic arch, and it's made up of a portion of the zygomatic bone. This is called the temporal process of the zygomatic bone. This is the frontal process of the zygomatic, and then this entire thing is the zygomatic arch. The zygomatic arch is actually made up of the temporal process of the zygomatic and the zygomatic process of the temporal.